And particularly, I want to talk about the history of freedom of information legislation, because I feel that legislation is kind of like what we would all look to as like the great example from before us around kind of open government, transparency, rethinking the way government works, making it more accessible to people. Like FOIA legislation really is kind of a template for where Gov 2.0 kind of came out of and what we were looking to. And if you look at the history of that legislation, I think there's a really interesting narrative that exists out there that I find a little challenging and problematic, because it's a narrative that I think reveals the sources of that legislation in a way that kind of undermine the contributions that I think we'd like to be making, and don't tell kind of as a complete story to make future generations that want to make change as powerful as they could be. So if you look at FOIA legislation, you can go all the way back to 1766. That's when Sweden passed the kind of what's widely seen as the first access information law, which was basically, I believe, in their constitution, where you could go in and look at documents. So that's interesting, but it's a little bit of an outlier. So you have to kind of go all the way to 1966. Can I go back a slide, please? To 1966. And then the United States passes legislation that, again, now starts to do the same thing, but they're thinking, OK, well, how do we give people access to documents? That kind of serves as a template for a bunch of other people. So kind of more countries start to think about doing this. And in 1974, the United States actually amends the act and adds all sorts of changes to it that actually give it real teeth. So now all of a sudden there's judicial review. So if you make a request, it gets denied. You actually have like a way that you can go and complain, whereas before it was just like go away. So it gives it like real teeth. So it becomes the model. And then all of a sudden you get a whole bunch more countries want to do it, and then continues to get more and more countries. And I don't actually even list them all here. The narrative here is that political crisis creates an opportunity, and all of a sudden you have this legislation. And I have to ask you, why? Like, why is it in this moment that we have access information legislation come about? And some people will point to this guy, Congressman Moss. He's from California. He was very worried about all the spending on defense that was going on, and he said the public needs to have access to documents to see how much money is getting spent on defense as this Cold War begins to ramp up. And so he's actually the sponsor of the original act. And then I think, if you flash forward and you say, well, why did then the US go and amend it and make it stronger? Well, most people would point to the kind work of this man and the political movement he created that was actually in opposition to everything he did. For those of you who don't know who this is actually Richard Nixon. This is kind of a more modern view of what he looks like for those who are younger in the audience. I actually date myself by even using a Futurama reference. Kind of sad, but he does a whole bunch of things that kind of make people upset, and that creates political impetus to reform the law, give it all way more strength. But I ask you, why Nixon? It's not like we've not had political scandals in this country and other countries around the world. I mean, you can go back to the 1920s, and there's President Harding, and he has something called the Ohio Gang, which is 5 guys who are in his cabinet who are widely seen as being very, very dubious characters, up to all sorts of no good. Why didn't that crisis prompt RTI legislation? Why is it that suddenly in the 60s and 70s, this begins to take off? And so when I look at this narrative, I don't feel like it answers that question. But I do think there's another narrative that actually kind of does. And it's the invention of this device. This is the Xerox 914. It's the first kind of widely available photocopier. And it is invented in 1960, goes on the market at that time. And it, interestingly, gets called by Fortune as the single most important and most successful launch of a product in the history of the United States. In fact, let's look at this timeline. In 1960, Xerox 914 comes on the market. By 1968, they are doing $1 billion a year in revenue in 1968 dollars. To put this into context, between 50 and 59, Xerox did $12.5 million in revenue total over the entire decade. If that doesn't blow your mind enough, 2 years later, they're doing $1.6 billion in revenue. So you do 60% growth, and people are like, wow, man, that's really great. You do 60% growth on $1 billion in revenue? That's incredible. And in fact, they get vaulted into being one of the top 100 in size companies in the United States of America. By 1980, they're actually doing $8 billion in sales. But the most incredible thing about this is they're actually down to 60% market share, which shows you how big the market has actually grown by this point. This narrative strikes me as one that's very, very interesting, because I don't think it's possible to have FOIA legislation unless you have photocopiers. I mean, how are you going to distribute these documents? You're certainly not using carbon paper, and you're not retyping them all up. The entire notion of FOIA legislation is dependent on the existence of photocopiers. And so what you actually have is a combination of technology and opportunity and people power coming together to enable us to do something that previously we had not been able to do and give us access to government in a way that was previously not imaginable. And this is the equation that I think we were trying to talk about yesterday, and this is the equation that I think Code for America is all about. How do we create technology? How do we enable mayors, council people, elected officials to create the opportunity? And how, through the fellows, and even more importantly, through the brigades, do we create the people power to make it all happen? This is the equation that we are working with. And so what I think we're trying to do is figure out how are we going to change the government stack. Everything government does is built on a stack. And I think what challenged me about FOIA legislation is that we've been making assumptions about what the stack was. In fact, a lot of people will say, well, FOIA is like technology agnostic legislation. It was values-based. No, it was built on the stack. And the stack that it happened to be built on, that technology was the photocopier. And so if I look at kind of what the government stack could be, what I find interesting is we kind of basically stuck FOIA on the very top of it, and we didn't really care about what was happening deeper down here. We just knew we were creating documents, we had them, we were storing them somewhere, and then we would photocopy them in order to get them out. And FOIA just became this access layer that sat at the top of the stack, and that's all we played with. But the thing that I think is so interesting what's happened in the last 20 years is that that stack is being eaten by software. And that what FOIA legislation is trying to do is just make access possible by dealing with the processes that sit just at the very top of that stack. But what blows my mind is that software is process. And that rather than just playing with the very top of that stack, we now increasingly have an opportunity to think about how we can drive deeper and deeper and deeper into it. And so when I look at all of the talks that happened yesterday, when I look at Clay Shirky's keynote, when he talks about moving from technical problems to managerial problems to political problems, when I looked at all the presentations around how, like, first we were doing, let's figure out how to adopt hydrants. Now we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we monitor and enable ourselves to know what's going on in the prison system so we can make better decisions, to doing blight status, all these other things. We are moving deeper and deeper into this stack. So we started thinking about websites and design. But now we're playing more and more in place of this middle place where it's all about rules and processes and culture. And this is what we're trying to drive into that. Oh, sorry, can I go back a slide, please? This is what we're trying to drive into that. And I think if those were presentations that we focused on yesterday, one of the exciting things we're talking about today is the bottom of this stack. Because if software is process, one of the best ways to begin to think about how we're going to reshape process is by rethinking how we do procurement. So the second thing that I think happened yesterday that was interesting to me is all of these fantastic examples, all these things going on, I think it's easy for us to get caught up in this notion that we are the first. But the fact is we're not the first. The FOIA people have been here before us. There are other people who are tackling these problems. In fact, there are whole other communities out there, the ICT4D community, that's also thinking about similar problems to us. So we're not alone, and we're not the first. These are not bad things. These are actually wonderfully fantastic things. And I think the most interesting thing for me is how big the we are not alone part is. This company, Facebook, always strikes me as interesting because there are a lot of companies that try to do what Facebook did. And when you look at the technology that Facebook's built upon, most of it wasn't new. It wasn't something new came along that enabled Facebook to become what it was. It was that there was a group of people who grew up online, who realized the technology that already existed could be repurposed to do something that previously was not imaginable, particularly by people who hadn't grown up online. And when I look around in government right now, what gets me excited is I see all sorts of people who are growing up in the kind of Gov 2.0 ocean. Like for them, they haven't thought about doing it any other way. So I'm down in Santiago, and these guys are thinking about how we do accountability by default. We actually came up with this really cool plan where what we did is sorry if I could advance the slide right up. They have this slide. This is their Service Chile slide. The first thing I want you to do is look at this. This is like where you get services in Chile. What's really cool is this is the Service Colombia site, and you might notice that they're actually fairly similar. So the Colombians actually literally called them and said, hey, we stole your website. Isn't this awesome? And I was like, and everybody was like, yes, this is awesome. So now you have two guys, two different countries actually working off similar code bases so they can actually iterate, make changes, and help one another get better. More interesting still, they actually put this button down here. This was totally second nature to them. And this button basically says, would you like to have this service online? And if you're trying to get access to the service and you're like, oh, I know it exists, but it only can go into the office to get it, you click on this button and immediately you get to vote, say, yeah, I'd like it to be online. They then put all of those results online itself. And this became a list of priorities of what services need to be put online immediately. What is the public actually looking for? And it put pressure on the government to act on that and enable the public servants who are trying to do this. They're not the only ones. There's people who are thinking about open by default. This is up in Canada. This is called buyandsell.gc.ca. It's the procurement website. This thing built by people who have nothing to do with open government, not in any government, kind of open government like Policy Shop, anything like that, built an entire site around procurement with default as open, so you can go and find any contract any single time. You can actually follow a company, and you can actually track all of the contracts that they sign, everything that they bid on. Everything on here is open by default, and they're really just trying to destroy the entire access to information process so that you don't actually need it, or that when you do need it, it's for really sensitive documents that need to be vetted, but the core documents, anyone can get to. And then finally, another great example for me is sharing by default with these guys here. This is another project up in Canada. This is called the Web Experience Toolkit. This is up on GitHub. These guys are creating tools to enable website accessibility. And now you have the federal government, you have local governments, and you have regional governments all working off the same tools to enable their websites to be W3C compatible and YCAG compatible, WCAG compatible. All sharing, building the same tools, really working across the stack. So this all gets me excited, and I want to kind of close with a cautionary note that the stack is going to react to us. Whether you're a public servant inside trying to make change, or whether you're on the outside trying to advocate for change, it's not just going to simply accept this. And some of those things, the way it's going to react, are actually going to be things that I think we need to be thinking very carefully about. And that is, we've got to be thinking about notions of power and how we change the stack and who wins and who loses in those changes. And for people who believe that, when we get more data, it's simply going to create like kind of this utopia where we can predict where the flu is going to happen and everything's going to be wonderful and the great algorithm in the sky is going to rule us all in a kind of this beautiful way and make life simple, I want to dispel us of that notion. Because data doesn't just allow evidence-based decision. It also allows things like this. Like, you don't get to this unless you have an enormous amount of data that tells you that this is how you should draw a congressional boundary. So data is power, and so we got to be thinking about who are we enabling and who are we disenabling. And in my own country, we've actually figured out that if we're collecting data, that's going to educate people and inform them. They might actually ask for change, and so we've actually terminated functionally, we made it volunteer, what's called the long-form census. So all of this data about poverty, about marginalized communities, now is basically ineffective in our country. So what you now realize is that when the politicians recognize that the data is going to be made open eventually, one of the risks that we have is they're going to say, well, we're going to control what gets collected. Because if you can control what data gets collected or doesn't get collected, you get to control everything else that happens after that in the stack. So we have a responsibility, if we're going to be thinking about data, to figure out how the community is going to react to it, how the stack's going to react to it. So I don't want us just to be celebrating our successes. I want us to be challenging ourselves with what the future looks like and how we can be making it better.